is probably the single biggest reason they never get free of it. The way stress gets talked about in self-help and popular psychology, you'd think it just rolls in without any warning and there's nothing you can do but brace for it. But what's actually happening for a lot of people is something much simpler and honestly, much more fixable. Stress, in most cases, is not the event itself. It's the mental spin you generate on top of the event. And that spin is where almost all of the real suffering actually lives. Now, the most effective way to break free of any destructive mental pattern is never about fighting the pattern with willpower. It's always about realizing that the thing you are fighting is largely an illusion. And once you truly see through that trick, there is nothing left to fight against. And stress, for a lot of us, tends to follow this exact same loop where something happens, you build a story around it, the story creates tension, and then you spend all this energy trying to manage the tension without ever going back to question the story that started the whole thing in the first place. The moment you stop treating that mental narrative as hard fact and start seeing it for what it actually is, which is just another thought that popped up and feels convincing, a lot of the emotional charge tends to fall away on its own without you ever having to do anything. And I'm not saying you should pretend that your problems are fake or act like nothing matters and nothing is really happening. It's about noticing that your reaction to the problem is usually doing significantly more damage than the problem itself. And that gap between what actually happened and what your mind made of it is really something that you can genuinely learn to work with. And the beautiful part is that once you see this mechanism clearly, you probably can't unsee it, which is the entire point of understanding it. Now, the stress response you feel, that tightness, that low-grade dread, and that sense of something is about to go wrong, most of the time it's not really pointing to any real danger in front of you. It's pointing at a future you most likely imagined, a scenario your mind constructed from fragments of past experience and general worry about what could possibly happen next. Now, your body doesn't actually know the difference between a real threat and an imagined one, which means you can sit in a perfectly safe room and flood yourself with the exact same chemicals you'd produce if something genuinely dangerous were happening right in front of you. Now, once you realize that, once you truly get that you are often manufacturing the very feeling you're trying to escape, it changes your entire relationship with the experience. It's not something happening to you anymore. It's something you're doing to yourself, and you can learn to stop. Now, there's something that gets missed almost every time people talk about stress. And I think it changes the whole conversation. There is a real and meaningful difference between chosen stress and imposed stress. And most people lump them together like they're the exact same experience when they're fundamentally not. So chosen stress is what shows up when you commit to something that actually matters, when you take on weight deliberately, because the outcome is worth carrying it for. And that's a completely different animal from the stress that gets dropped on you without your permission. Now think about someone training for a competition or building a business from nothing or raising a kid. That stress is real. Nobody's saying it isn't. But the fact that you chose it on purpose changes everything about how it feels. It's not suffering in the traditional sense. It's more like the soreness after a workout, the feeling that tells you that you're actually growing. And most people who feel this kind of stress would actually feel worse without it because it's connected to something they genuinely care about. Now, the problem starts when people forget they chose the hard thing and begin treating their own voluntary commitment like a prison sentence someone forced on them, which then tends to happen gradually and subtly over time. When the why behind the effort stays clear and present in your mind, the stress stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like fuel, like evidence that you're in motion and engaged with something real. Imposed stress is the other kind, and it's the stuff that genuinely lands on you from outside without any say on your part. A health scare, a layoff, someone you trusted letting you down, circumstances you couldn't have predicted and definitely didn't sign up for. Now, this kind of stress can feel heavier in some ways because there's no narrative of choice to hold on to. But even as a quick side strategy, before we move on, there's something you can do with imposed stress that changes the entire feeling of it almost instantly. You take extreme ownership of it. Whatever landed on your lap that you didn't ask for, you look at it and you say, this is mine now. I'm choosing to deal with this. I'm choosing to face it. I'm choosing to handle it on my terms. And what that does psychologically is move the experience from the imposed category into the chosen category. And yes, you didn't choose the event, but you can choose your response to it with full force and full commitment. And that change from passive recipient to active owner tends to dissolve a surprising amount of the heaviness that actually comes with feeling like life just happened to you. And it can be as simple as saying, I'm choosing this. I know it sounds simple and maybe even a bit funny, but if you open your mind and use it, it can put you in a completely different state. But even here, even with the legitimately imposed stress, the same principle still tends to apply. The event is the event. What makes it unbearable for most people is not the event itself, but the endless replaying and catastrophizing and mental looping that actually follows it. So learning to separate the actual situation from your mental commentary about the situation is probably the single most useful skill you'll ever develop when it comes to dealing with things you didn't choose and can't control. And the moment you make that separation, even just partially, you start to feel like you have some say in the matter again, which for most people is what they actually needed all along. Now, here's where it starts to get really interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable for some people. The stress you feel on a daily basis, that background tension that so many people describe as just being their normal state of existence, is in most cases being generated by a story you're telling yourself that you've repeated so many times it doesn't feel like a story anymore. And the story tends to have a very particular structure to it. Something bad is happening or about to happen. I'm not ready for it. I can't handle it. And if I don't figure this out, something terrible is going to follow. So the thing about this kind of internal storytelling is that it feeds on itself in a way that can be really hard to interrupt unless you know what you're looking for. You feel stressed, which makes you think something must be wrong, which generates more stress, which confirms the original feeling. And now you're spinning in a loop that has no exit because the proof and the problem are the same thing. Now your brain is incredibly good at finding evidence for whatever it already believes. So once the stress narrative is running, everything you encounter starts to look like confirmation that you should indeed be stressed. So breaking the loop often just requires one honest moment of asking yourself whether the thing you're stressed about right now is actually happening right now, or whether you're reacting to a projection of something that might happen later. And for a lot of people, stress has become the default setting, the background noise they're so used to that they don't even recognize it as optional anymore. And it's basically like living next to a highway. After a while, you stop hearing the traffic, but it's still affecting everything, your sleep, your mood, your ability to think clearly and be present. Just because something feels normal doesn't mean it's necessary. So the possibility that you could exist without that constant baseline tension is something most people have never actually considered. Not because it's unrealistic, but because they've never been shown that the tension is something they're generating themselves rather than something the world is inflicting on them. So let's talk about what's actually happening under the hood when you experience what people call stress, because understanding the mechanism itself is really what makes this whole approach work. So here's how the cycle tends to work for a lot of people. You create tension by overthinking a situation. You then try some coping mechanism or distraction to relieve the tension. The coping works temporarily, and then the overthinking returns because you never addressed the root of the problem. You only managed the symptom. The relief never lasts because you're treating what's on the surface while the thing underneath keeps producing more of the same feeling. Now, the root in most cases is not the external situation at all. It's your relationship to uncertainty and your habit of filling that uncertainty with worst-case narratives. And until you address that habit at its source, no other stress management technique will do anything more than temporarily take the edge off. Now, most stress advice operates entirely at the surface level, at the symptom level, giving you tools to cope with the feeling of stress without ever helping you understand why you keep producing the feeling of stress in the first place. So going deeper means looking at the assumptions you're carrying about what stress is and what it means about you and what it's trying to protect you from. Because in a lot of cases, it's not protecting you from anything real. And that can be a confronting thing to sit with, honestly, because it means taking some responsibility for an experience you've probably been blaming on your circumstances or your job or your relationships or just life in general. Now, the genuinely freeing part of all of this is how simple it tends to be once you see it. Not easy necessarily, but because seeing through a pattern you've been running for years takes some willingness to be uncomfortable for a moment, but it is simple. The stress was never the problem. Your interpretation of the stress was the problem. And interpretations can actually change. And that distinction from fighting the feeling to questioning the interpretation is what makes the difference between someone who manages stress and someone who actually gets free of it. For some people, this makes sense instantly, like a switch flipping. For others, it's more gradual, more of a slow dawning. Either way is fine. The point is that once the mechanism is seen, it loses most of its power. Now, everything we're going to cover from here on out, the philosophy, the psychology, the practical application, all of it sits on top of this one idea. Stress